Dorian Wright had everything: wealth, power, and a life of luxury. But as he stood outside his wife Seraphina's hospital room, he realized he had lost the one thing that mattered most. Seraphina Hale had spent years believing she had the perfect life. Married to Dorian Hale, a billionaire investor with a powerful presence and an empire built on calculated risks, she felt secure in the world they had created together. Their lavish mansion, expensive vacations, and glittering social life painted a picture of success and love. But behind the grand gestures and diamond-studded anniversaries, cracks had begun to form. At 7 months pregnant, Seraphina's excitement for motherhood overshadowed the small signs that something was wrong. Dorian had become increasingly distant, his once affectionate gestures replaced by cold, dismissive responses. Business trips grew longer, and late-night meetings became more frequent. When he did come home, he barely acknowledged her growing belly. Seraphina told herself he was just stressed. Building an empire required sacrifice. She convinced herself that after the baby arrived, things would go back to the way they used to be. But doubt gnawed at her. The unease in her chest grew heavier each time he silenced his phone, when she entered the room, or left abruptly after receiving a mysterious text. She dismissed it at first, telling herself she was being paranoid. Hormones, exhaustion, and the overwhelming changes that came with pregnancy could easily make someone overthink. But as the weeks passed, her intuition screamed that something was terribly wrong. One evening, Dorian left for yet another urgent business trip. His suitcase was packed hastily, his goodbye rushed. As soon as he walked out the door, Seraphina felt suffocated by the silence he left behind. She picked up his iPad, something she had never done before. Trust had been the foundation of their marriage, and she had never questioned him. But tonight was different. She hesitated before opening his email, her heart pounding in her chest. What she found shattered her world. Hotel reservations in Paris, luxury yacht bookings, extravagant jewelry purchases, all made in the past few months. And none of them had been for her. Attached to one of the receipts was a message. "Can't wait to see you tonight, love." The recipient's name made her stomach turn. Celeste Navarro, a model whose face graced billboards and magazine covers. Seraphina sat frozen, her breath shallow. She clicked on the gallery, finding dozens of photos of Dorian with Celeste. Wrapped in each other's arms on a private beach, laughing at candlelit dinners, sharing intimate moments she thought were reserved for their marriage. Every image was another knife to her heart, each one confirming the betrayal she had desperately hoped wasn't real. Her hands trembled as she put the iPad down. The room around her blurred, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. She had given everything to this man, her love, her loyalty, and now her unborn child. And he had replaced her with someone younger, someone who had never sacrificed a single thing for him. She wanted to scream, to throw the device against the wall, to demand answers. But she knew that no excuse could undo what had been done. Dorian had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. Hours passed as she sat in the darkness, staring at nothing. The weight of her unborn child pressed against her ribs, a painful reminder that she was no longer just fighting for herself. She had to protect her baby from the pain of growing up in a broken home filled with lies. When Dorian returned a few days later, smelling of expensive cologne and stolen moments with another woman, she said nothing. She simply watched him with a hollow expression as he kissed her forehead out of habit, oblivious to the fact that she knew everything. As he walked away, checking his phone with a smirk, she realized the man she had loved was gone. All that remained was a stranger, and she would not let him destroy her any further. Seraphina had spent days trapped in a fog of heartbreak, trying to understand how the man she loved had become so cold, so distant. The evidence of his betrayal haunted her, replaying in her mind every time she closed her eyes. But there was no time to grieve. Her body ached, her pregnancy progressing faster than she had expected, and the stress weighed heavily on her. She knew she couldn't afford to break down. Not now, not when she had a child depending on her. Determined to confront Dorian, she waited until he returned from another one of his supposed business trips. When she showed him the evidence, expecting even a sliver of remorse, she was met with indifference. He barely glanced at the screen before shrugging, acting as if his affair was insignificant. He denied any wrongdoing, claiming she was being overly emotional, blaming her hormones for making her dramatic. His reaction stung more than the betrayal itself. He didn't even try to lie, didn't attempt to salvage the trust he had shattered. Instead, he dismissed her as if her pain meant nothing. She couldn't fight with him. She had no strength left. The betrayal had drained her, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. But deep inside, something shifted. A quiet rage replaced her sorrow. She saw him clearly now, not as the man she had fallen in love with, but as a stranger who had abandoned her long before she even realized it. Days passed in silence. Dorian barely acknowledged her existence, treating their home like a hotel, where he stayed when he had no better options. His phone never left his hand, and his mind was always somewhere else, most likely with Celeste. The house, once filled with warmth and anticipation for the baby's arrival, now felt cold and lifeless. Seraphina spent most of her time alone, preparing for the baby's birth without the support of the man who should have been by her side. Then, one evening, it happened. A sharp pain shot through her abdomen, stealing her breath. She clutched her belly, a deep sense of fear settling in. It was too soon. She wasn't ready. The baby wasn't ready. Panic took hold as the pain intensified, waves of contractions rolling through her body, each one more unbearable than the last. She needed to get to the hospital, immediately. She reached for her phone and dialed Dorian's number. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Desperation clawed at her chest. She needed him now more than ever, but he was unreachable. He had abandoned her in the most crucial moment of her life, forcing herself. To focus, she called for an ambulance. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was barely able to stand. They rushed her into the vehicle, her vision blurred from tears and pain. As they sped toward the hospital, she realized that this was how it would always be, her fighting alone, while Dorian indulged in his selfish desires. Inside the delivery room, fear gripped her as the doctors and nurses moved around her, shouting instructions she could barely process. She wanted to be strong, but the reality of her situation weighed heavily on her. She was giving birth alone. The man who had promised to love and cherish her had left her in her most vulnerable moment. Meanwhile, miles away, Dorian was sipping champagne on a private yacht, laughing with Celeste as the world around him fell apart. He had ignored every call, every message. He didn't know, and worse, he didn't care. Seraphina clenched her teeth, determined to bring her baby into the world without him. She would not let his absence define this moment. She had already lost so much, but she refused to let him take this from her. As another contraction hit, she braced herself, knowing she was on her own. The hospital room was sterile and cold, filled with the beeping of monitors and the muffled voices of nurses rushing around her. Seraphina lay on the hospital bed, her body drenched in sweat as another contraction tore through her. The pain was unbearable, her vision swimming as she clutched the thin sheets beneath her. She was exhausted, terrified, and completely alone. Doctors shouted instructions, nurses adjusted IVs, and the fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, making the room feel even more impersonal. It wasn't supposed to be this way. She had envisioned this moment so differently, Dorian by her side, holding her hand, whispering encouragement as their child entered the world. But instead, She was surrounded by strangers, and the only thing keeping her grounded was the instinct to protect the tiny life struggling to come into existence. She pushed through the agony, her body trembling as she fought against the exhaustion, threatening to pull her under. She had never felt so vulnerable, so abandoned. Every second felt like an eternity, but she refused to give up. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, the cries of her newborn baby echoed through the room. Relief washed over her as she gasped for breath, tears slipping down her face. A nurse gently placed the tiny, wriggling baby in her arms. Seraphina's heart swelled as she looked down at the little face staring back at her. The pain, the betrayal, the loneliness, all of it faded into the background. At this moment, there was only love. Her child, her reason to keep fighting. As she held her newborn close, the doctor informed her that the baby had arrived earlier than expected but was strong and healthy. A flood of emotions overwhelmed her, joy, exhaustion, and a deep sorrow. That Dorian had missed this moment. Not that he would have cared. The man who had once sworn to love her had abandoned her when she needed him most. A nurse took the baby to be cleaned and checked, and Seraphina lay back against the pillows, feeling the weight of everything crash down on her. She should have been celebrating, basking in the happiness of bringing a new life into the world. But instead, all she felt was emptiness. Meanwhile, miles away, Dorian was oblivious. He was in an exclusive hotel suite, the city skyline glittering beyond the glass windows. Celeste lounged beside him, sipping from an expensive glass of wine, unaware of the chaos he had left behind. His phone sat on the table, vibrating with unanswered calls and unread messages. When he finally glanced at it, irritation flickered across his face. He saw missed calls from an unknown number, a few texts from the hospital. Confusion clouded his mind before realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. His wife. The baby. A rush of panic coursed through him, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, so blinded by his selfish desires, that he had completely ignored the most important moment of his life. Shame clawed at his throat as he grabbed his jacket, ignoring Celeste's questions. He had made a mistake, one he could never take back. Back at the hospital, Seraphina stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had given birth alone, suffered alone, and survived alone. And as she looked at her sleeping baby in the bassinet, beside her, a realization settled deep within her soul. She didn't need Dorian. She never had. And when he finally came crawling back, she would make sure he felt every ounce of regret he deserved. Dorian's expensive car sped through the city streets, his heart hammering in his chest as he weaved through traffic. The hospital's name on his phone screen burned into his vision, a painful reminder of everything he had ignored. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, regret clawing at his throat. He had abandoned his wife, dismissed her cries for help, and now he didn't even know if she or the baby had made it through safely. Flashes of their life together ran through his mind. The lavish wedding, the honeymoon in Santorini, the nights. They had spent planning for a future he had slowly lost interest in. He had taken everything for granted, chasing distractions while his wife carried their child alone. The realization settled deep in his gut, like a sickness he couldn't shake. When he arrived at the hospital, he barely remembered parking the car before rushing inside. The scent of antiseptic filled the air as he approached the front desk, breathless and panicked. He gave Seraphina's name, tapping his fingers anxiously against the counter. The nurse behind the desk barely looked at him before giving him the room number. No congratulations, no sympathy, just a simple direction, as if he were any other visitor. As he made his way down the hall, his polished shoes echoed against the tile, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached her, "Door!" He hesitated. His fingers hovered over the handle, doubt creeping into his mind. He had never felt fear like this before. Not in the boardroom, not in high-stakes deals, not even when his affair had been exposed. But now, standing outside the room of the woman he had betrayed, he felt truly powerless. Steeling himself, he pushed open the door. Inside, Seraphina sat, upright in the hospital bed, her face pale but her expression unreadable. In the bassinet beside her, their newborn baby lay sleeping, wrapped in soft blankets. The sight should have filled him with joy, but instead it made his stomach twist, with shame. This was supposed to be a moment they shared together. Yet he had thrown it away for a woman who meant nothing in the grand scheme of his life. Seraphina didn't look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the tiny baby, her fingers gently brushing over the delicate forehead. There was no anger in her face, no accusations in her posture, just an eerie calm that unsettled him more than if she had been screaming. He took a slow step forward, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to form. He had built his entire life on charm and persuasion, but no amount of smooth talking could erase what he had done. As he stood there, watching the life he had nearly destroyed, a painful realization settled over him. He had always believed he was in control, that his wealth and power shielded him from consequences. But standing in this room, facing the woman who had endured so much without him, he saw the truth. He had lost her. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a quiet, irreversible shift. She didn't need him anymore, and for the first time in his life, Dorian Wright regretted everything. Dorian stood frozen at the door, watching Seraphina cradle their child with a tenderness that made his chest ache. The soft rise and fall of the baby's breathing filled the silence, but it did nothing to soothe the weight pressing down on him. He had imagined countless ways this moment would go, perhaps anger, perhaps tears, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet indifference in Seraphina's eyes when she finally glanced up at him. Her expression was unreadable, as though he were nothing more than a stranger who had wandered into the wrong hospital room. It was that look, more than anything, that made his heart plummet. He stepped forward cautiously, as if approaching a fragile glass sculpture, terrified that any wrong move would shatter what little remained between them. He wanted to say something, but what words could possibly undo the damage he had caused? Seraphina turned her gaze back to the baby, gently tracing the tiny features with her fingertips. There was something unbreakable about her now, something stronger than the woman he had once known. She had endured the most painful moment of her life alone, and she had survived it. Without him. The realization cut deeper than he expected. Dorian's eyes flickered to the bassinet where his newborn lay peacefully. He had missed it. The birth, the first cry, the first time Seraphina had held their child in her arms. These were moments that could never be rewound, no matter how much money or influence he had. He had been so consumed by his selfish desires that he had let the most important moment of his life slip through his fingers. Regret burned in his chest, suffocating him. He took another step closer, hesitating before speaking. His voice came out quieter than he intended, but it didn't matter. Seraphina's posture remained unchanged, her attention solely on the tiny life she had brought into the world. He reached out slightly, but she shifted, turning away just enough to make it clear he wasn't needed. He had made his choice, and now she had made hers. The weight of his mistakes settled heavily on his shoulders. Dorian had spent his entire life believing he could buy his way out of anything, that his charm and power made him untouchable. But no amount of money could erase the hollow feeling in his chest, the undeniable truth that he had lost something he could never get back. The silence stretched between them, thicker than glass. He had thought regret would come in the form of public disgrace, financial ruin, or a tarnished reputation. But this quiet rejection, this moment where he saw the future slipping away, was far worse than anything he had ever imagined. Seraphina finally looked up again, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. But she didn't have to say anything. He understood. She had moved on. Not in a dramatic way, not with rage or vengeance, but in a way that was permanent. She no longer waited for him, and that was his punishment. Dorian turned slightly, glancing at the door, his body reluctant to leave. But deep down, he knew he had no place here anymore. He had made a choice, and now she had too. With a final glance at the child he had abandoned in the most crucial moment, Dorian stepped back, feeling the emptiness swallow him whole. As he walked out of the room, he realized that this wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of everything.